The United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement.
Pete Hegseth has officially started making a fool of himself worldwide, not just here at home. Republicans are finding out the hard way that if they let the drunk drive the car, we might all end up in the ditch, except in this case more like the trenches.
Take cover in the trench!
A top conservative editor for National Review wrote a blistering review of Pete's last few days, flip-flopping on whether or not Ukraine should be a part of NATO. You know, Ukraine, our ally, who the United States has been helping fend off the much larger Russia for the last 2 years. Well, now all of a sudden Pete Hegseth says they shouldn't be a part of NATO. Except maybe now they should? Honestly, I don't even think old Whiskey Pete can keep it together. We all know how he responds to stress.
You passed out in the back of a party bus. Is that true or false?
Anonymous smears.
Well, at least we know he's sober for this, because anonymous smears is very hard to say when you're drunk.
And apparently only a week into the job, his conduct is getting bad enough that the editor of National Review is writing these scathing articles. You're gonna want to see how bad he lets him have it. If you're enjoying the content here at Really American, go ahead and like the video. It really helps out the channel. And double check that you're subscribed. Generally, the Secretary of Defense is a position that's held with some level of dignity, serving mostly as a holding place for the revolving door of defense industry executives who are just human enough to put in front of the cameras. The current occupier of the position has more experience in front of cameras than he does in front of diplomats, and his inexperience is starting to show. This concerns all of us, because as Elon Musk and his cronies at Doge dismantled the soft power that the United States has through US aid, and Donald Trump dismantles our economic power by driving all of our trading partners into the open arms of BRICS, other kind of power that we have is military power. Hard power, as Pete Hegseth likes to say. Something that you'd think these radical right-wing nuts would want to protect at all costs. After all, there's nothing an amosexual loves more than shooting something.
We can talk all we want about values. Values are important. But you can't shoot values. You can't shoot flags, and you can't shoot strong speeches. There is no replacement for hard power. As much as we may not want to like the world we live in some cases, there's nothing like hard power.
You can't shoot values, you can't shoot integrity, you can't shoot honesty, but you can shoot a fifth of whiskey when no one's looking, huh, Pete?
Julian! I don't know where I felt like I get a little drink around here, do you, bud?
What kind of frat boy crazy yeehaw bullshit is that? It's never been more clear that Pete Hegseth has the moral integrity of one-ply toilet paper, because it's not just us on the left pointing that out. Here's the article from the senior editor at the National Review, a very conservative newspaper, mind you. I will warn you that this guy isn't exactly a woke superstar or anything. He's got a lot of backwards views too, but it's interesting to see how he attacks Pete. I've been cautiously optimistic about Pete Hegseth's appointment as Secretary of Defense. It's undoubtedly true that a culture of waste, inefficiency, and rot has built up in the Pentagon. Now that I agree with. In these parlous times, the United States military needs to have a laser focus on rebuilding its strength and streamlining itself as a war-winning organization. Yikes. De-woking the military, however, is a necessary but insufficient job description for the US Secretary of Defense. I don't know how necessary it is, seeing as how they de-woked aviation and now planes are falling out of the sky every day. Hegseth's role is also to speak for the Trump administration and establish crystal clear US policy in the realm of military and security affairs. That's why Hegseth's last 48 hours have been so surprising and so disappointing. Yesterday, in prepared remarks they italicized to emphasize that they thought about this before they said it, to a gathering of allied defense ministers at NATO Headquarters, Hegseth announced that while the United States was committed to a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine, it was an unrealistic objective for the West to push for a return to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders. He's basically advocating for Ukraine to let Russia have the territory that they stole. This administration is not beating the Russian asset allegations. I'll play you the full clip of what Pete said himself.
We want, like you, a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine. But we must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective. Chasing this illusionary goal will only prolong the war and cause more suffering. The United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. Instead, any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. If these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5.
Way to show all of our allies that they can't trust a word we say, Pete Hegseth, just throwing away decades of goodwill because Trump is unable to say anything bad about Putin. Here's the rotten squash himself refusing to blame Putin for invading Ukraine.
To Ukraine as well, yesterday you mentioned that you thought Ukraine's NATO aspirations were one of the main reasons that the war broke out. Who do you blame for the war, Ukraine or Russia?
Well, I think that there were a lot of people to blame. All I can say is very simply, if I were president, that war would never have happened.
War wouldn't have happened because he would have helped Russia take over Ukraine. And this was such an insane thing for Pete to say that it only took 24 hours for him to have to walk back these statements at the NATO headquarters.
Why not invoke Article 5 then for the NATO peacekeeping forces that could potentially be deployed? How does that deter President Putin?
Well, I would say, I want to be clear about something as it pertains to NATO membership not being realistic outcome for negotiations. That's something that was stated as part of my remarks here, as part of a coordination with how we're executing these ongoing negotiations, which are led by President Trump. All of that said, these negotiations are led by President Trump. Everything is on the table in his conversations with Vladimir Putin and Zelensky. What he decides to allow or not allow is at the purview of the leader of the free world, of President Trump. So I'm not going to stand at this podium and declare what President Trump will do or won't do, what will be in or what will be out, what concessions will be made or what concessions are not made. I can look, as our team has, of what's realistic, likely on an outcome. I think realism is an important part of the conversation that hasn't existed enough inside conversations amongst friends. But simply pointing out realism, like the borders won't be rolled back to what everybody would like them to be in 2014, is not a concession to Vladimir Putin. It's a recognition of the hard power realities on the ground after a lot of investment and sacrifice, first by the Ukrainians and then by allies, and then a realization that a negotiated peace is going to be some sort of demarcation that neither side wants. But it's not my job as the Secretary of Defense to define the parameters of the President of the United States as he leads some of the most complex and consequential negotiations in the world.
But it is your job as the Secretary of Defense to project strength against your enemies. We are on the side of Ukraine here in the United States. So telling Russia that they've done enough damage to Ukraine to take rolling back the borders to 2014 off the table is a concession. That's by definition a concession. I've noticed that Trump and all of his little lackeys do this little game, that Trump pretends that he doesn't know what's going on, that all of these people are just working independently. And then when they're pressed, they say, oh, Trump is the one in charge, Trump is handling it, he's going to do everything himself. Nobody takes credit or responsibility for any of the damage that they're doing. They're all just bumbling through, relying on their common sense. But I think we all know that common sense isn't exactly common. Nobody likes this wishy-washy Secretary of Defense act that Pete is putting on. Even the conservatives. Going back to this article for the National Review, the editor says this: look, the Secretary of Defense shouldn't set overall policy, that's the president's job. No one is arguing that point, I'm certainly not, and I don't object to the injection of some hard-headed realpolitik into U.S. foreign policy under the new administration. But that doesn't excuse Hegseth and his staff for the amateur hour bungling of yesterday's speech and policy declaration. Who cleared Hegseth's prepared speech? Did the White House, and then Trump changed his mind on the policy on Ukraine and NATO membership? Or did Hegseth and the DoD not ensure that their critical policy declaration was aligned with the president's view? Who told Hegseth to walk back today what he said yesterday? Is the Secretary of Defense out of the loop? Either way, it's a very disappointing moment for a team that is supposed to be taking over from and improving on the feckless performance of Joe Biden's foreign policy team. Pete Hegseth is giving the impression that the Secretary of Defense doesn't speak for the president, which is a dangerous place for us to be. That is my exact sentiment. He's pretending like he doesn't speak for the president, like what he says and does doesn't go through the president first. That's the president's job. But clearly, Donald Trump is more interested in golfing and getting hot air blown up his butt than he is doing any actual governing. For example, remember when he said he was going to review each and every Jan 6 case before he pardons them? Yeah, right. He just said select all, except.
Yes, to all. Yeah, there you go. Now everybody's happy.
Except in real life, nobody is happy with this administration. I'm Tony Hinderman with Really American, and I'll catch you next time.